misunderstand me. I'm not against America. But we need to have our ideologies challenged by God, right? And so it's an inconvenient truth to think that the people who want to establish their own life by force are filled with violence. That's what violence is, right? Those are the people who are filled with violence. Now, Jesus then also comes and says, talks about the peacemakers. And that's why my heart grieves right now, because we don't just have suffering going on, but then we have a bunch of people eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil concerning the suffering. And the church is supposed to be the peacemakers in the earth, and 95% of the church are propagating the eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So now we're heaping more destruction upon the suffering that's already going down. And so who's the peacemakers? Do you know who the peacemakers? This is an inconvenient truth for us. We don't like this because it's not consistent with our idea of what justice is. Which, listen, man, one of the reasons why we got a twisted view of what justice is because we got a twisted view of what God thinks justice is, right? But this is how Jesus described the peacemakers. That when they're faced with injustice, when a peacemaker is faced with injustice, do you know what they do? They turn the other cheek. They love their enemies. They bless those who curse them. They pray for those that despitefully use them. And do you know what they pray? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's a peacemaker. That's a peacemaker. And we don't have any of that going on. And we have a whole lot of the other going on. And what it's doing is, because the way we're trying to deal with the suffering is born from self-justification, what it does is it stirs up strife and envy and backbiting and gossip, where you're devouring one another. So walking after the Spirit and walking after the flesh, within this dynamic, do you know what walking after the Spirit would look like? When I face injustice, I'm going to look to God and what he's done in raising Jesus from the dead to serve me with justice. I'm not going to look to the arm of the flesh to take justice, right, or try to force justice. That's walking after the Spirit, right? Injustice is in the earth, and when you face injustice, you look to the justice God served all people with when he raised Jesus from the dead, having conquered death. You're walking after the Spirit. Now, that will cause you to love your enemies, right? But if you're walking after the flesh,
sorry, just a second.
Is that in the face of injustice or in the face of encountering justice, you now going to look to your own ability to try to bring about justice, walking after the flesh. And that will cause you to backbite and devour one another instead of loving one another, right? Yep. Where you look at each other and you decide whether or not you think the other person is doing what they should be doing or not. That's backbiting and devouring. That's born from walking after the flesh, right? Whereby if they're not doing what you think needs to be done in order to bring about life, then they now become the enemy, right? You see the whole problem with that. You decide what needs to be done in order to bring forth life. Right? And now you're going to get busy judging all the people around you by whether or not they're implementing your idea about how we're going to bring forth life. All the while, you got no idea about how to bring forth life, right? All the while, you're actually implementing the thing that brings forth more destruction, right? That's what's going on. And so, man, we need peacemakers. Yep. We need people that would feel compassion for everyone. How can you recognize any kind of a movement, and whether it's born from the world, it divides people up. It divides them up by race. It divides them up by sex. It divides them up by money. It divides them up by any different thing that it can do. It gets the people divided. That's how you know something comes from the world, right? How do you know something that comes from God? It doesn't divide anybody up by the flesh. Jesus says he knows no person after the flesh. He said there's no more male or female. He doesn't divide human beings up by the color of their skin, by their money, by their sex, by their status, and all those things are foolishness in the eyes of God. Mm-hmm. So when you would speak to one human being, meaning that every human being has experienced the same kind of a thing. right? It's called death. We've all experienced death, and we all want to experience life. So that's why it's called the temptation common to humans. It doesn't say the temptation common to white people. It doesn't say the temptation common to black people. It doesn't say, well, this culture, the temptation is this and not that. The hell it does. It says the temptation that comes to every human being is death. Jesus came and stood in the face of that temptation. We're all the same. It's the same enemy we all have. The enemy is death. Now, death can bring forth different kinds of fruit. And it can bring forth this fruit of death and that fruit of death. And so it can be a different fruit of death that has reached out and touched all of us in a different way. But make no mistake about it, the enemy is still death. Right? That's the enemy. That's all of our enemy. It's death. The wisdom that's from above will never break human beings apart and separate them. It will never say things like, you don't understand my suffering. Guess what? That never came out of God's mouth. In the moment you said that, I don't care what you're hoping to bring about. That's the poison of asps. It's the poison of asps. When you talk to people like that, the hell they don't. They do understand. Go look at Jesus. Do you think Jesus understands your suffering? Well, if Jesus can understand your suffering, then every other human being can understand your suffering. Now, one of the reasons why we struggle to have compassion on each other is because we're told things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't know.
Yeah.
And then they'll tell you, you don't know. The hell I don't. Well, what do you think the person feels the moment you tell them they don't know?
Defensive. Yeah.
That's self-justification. Yeah. That whole conversation is based upon self-justification. And do you know what it silently tells the other person? Because I promise you, the other person has suffered at the hands of death. And the moment they're spoken to like that, do you know what they feel in their heart? They're making light of my suffering. Well, what do you think a person feels like when they feel someone else is making light of their suffering? Well, then screw their suffering.
That's right.
And now we got a bunch of people backbiting and devouring about who suffered most.
Right.
Who is it that suffered most? Have the police suffered more? Have the black people suffered more? What about these white devils that are letting the police do this? Yeah. Who suffered more? Do you see all that? Listen, man, we're not reasoning with God when we think like that. We are not reasoning with God. God's not sitting around thinking, I wonder who suffered more. Because God sees the enemy of all people is death. And he sees all people have suffered equally at the hands of death. All people. And what he would get all of us to do is identify or see ourselves in our suffering in the face of someone else. That's the only way you can feel compassion for a person, is if you can identify, I've suffered this way, and I see that same suffering, that same anguish, that same hurt that I felt over here, I see that in their face over there. Now you can identify, and you can feel, and you can come together and cry and grieve and weep together and encourage each other together, right? But the moment we can't identify with each other, forget about it, man. And the moment you come and tell someone they can't identify, forget about it, man. I promise you this, there's only one way to judge it. Every human being can identify with Jesus. Guess what that means? We can all identify with each other. Otherwise, how can we be one? So any kind of a thing that comes and tries to separate us and tell us we don't know, or they don't know, or only these people know, we can't. I mean, it sounds so wise in the world, right? They don't know. Come on, man. It's like stuff that never came out of God's mouth. And so we want to at least understand what we're busy with and who are the peacemakers. How did Jesus handle it when he stood in the face of injustice? How did he handle it? Turn the other cheek. He loved his enemies. He prayed for those that were despitefully using him. He blessed those who were cursing them. Father, forgive them, for they know not. He was being a peacemaker. That's the only way peace can come in the face of an injustice. That's the only way. And that's actually God's way of doing justice. That a peacemaker are the ones that are doing justice in the earth. Jesus was doing justice in the earth when he was on the cross, blessing those who cursed him. He was doing justice, but we don't want to hear that. because we want justice to be served in the sense of people being punished for their transgression. That's what